How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Welcome back to my conversation with Peter Docker, former Royal Air Force pilot, leadership consultant, and executive coach. In the first part of this interview, Peter walked us through the concept of what he calls Jumpseat Leadership and the personal experiences that led him to come up with it. Now, we're going to take a deeper look at Jumpseat Leadership using more familiar language within the context of culture and culture building. If I'm thinking about the things that are important in my life that resonate strongly with me, to the extent that I can articulate those and put words to them, I can begin to access that, to use your word, as a source of courage to help me maybe behave in ways I might not have naturally or reflexively gone to.
Yeah. So I'll give you two examples, because it's great talking about things in generalities, but it takes on meaning when we apply examples. So a few years ago, about 4 years ago now, I was working in this very room and I had a phone call from my wife, and her voice was quite shaky. And she said, "I've been involved in an accident. I'm okay, but the car is a mess." It was just about 2 miles down the road. And I put down the phone, I dropped everything I was doing. I jumped in the car and I drove to where my wife was. Now, let's examine that for a moment. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't know the situation. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there. But there was nothing that would have got in my way to getting in my car and driving to go and support my wife. Nothing. Okay. And that is, many of us have got family as something that is deeply important to us. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure most of your listeners would have done exactly the same if it's someone they cared for. Yeah. So that's an example of a stand, our family and our close friends, those dear to us. But let's give another life-changing example. Again, I've written about this in the book, which is I chose to go to university when I was 18, which feels like 100 years ago now, to study things that I'd never looked at before. But, that was another study. Yeah, but it was important to me at the time. Mm-hmm. But then halfway through my course, about 2 years in, something happened. It was 1982, and the Falkland Islands down the South Atlantic, and these two tiny islands off the Argentinian coast, they are a British territory and have been for centuries. And Argentina invaded those islands. And at the time, it was nothing to do about the politics. I didn't understand the politics of it. But what really incensed me was the fact that someone was imposing their will on others. In this case, the Argentinian forces imposing their will on the Falkland Islanders, who considered themselves very much to be British and still do to this day. And that affected me so much that I made a decision, which was I chose to leave university mid-course to join the Royal Air Force. And although I knew that the training and everything else, the selection, it would take years for me to become a pilot, way after the Falkland War was over and done with. But I wanted to join an organization where I felt that I could help those who could not help themselves in other situations like that in the future. I remember at the time, David, my tutors, my professors saying to me, "Look, are you sure, Peter, this is what you want to do? You're giving up. After 2 years, you've given up your degree and you're going off to join the Royal Air Force. Are you sure about this?" But I knew that's what I had to do. Mm-hmm. And so that's a choice I made. Now, when I reflect back more recently on that moment, the way I look upon that moment and the stand it gives me is what I describe as just mutual respect. And something that really incenses me is when I see someone not being respected for who they are, and that mutual respect piece is not present. that really deeply upsets me. And that's because it's a stand for something I believe. And that gives me guidance in times when I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what to do. I can go back to that stand and several others. And that gives me the courage to step forward into the unknown and to figure it out.
You know, as I listen to you talking about this, it reminds me of some of the connections in what we teach in our work. As many of our listeners know, I talk about creating a set of behaviors that people practice in an organization. We call them fundamentals because they're fundamental to success. And one of those we often talk about, it's actually one of my own fundamentals. We call it check the ego at the door. And it's about recognizing that so many ways in which ego gets in the way for people. And when our ego, and as I hear you, you would frame that in terms of fear driving that ego. But whether it's fear driving it or something else, when we are making decisions to serve our ego and letting that get in the way, it prevents us from making the best decisions. And I guess you would position that as love, when we can have love drive it, or what we're for driving it instead of our ego and the fear. That's what keeps us from making the best decisions.
No, I think I'd add to that a little, David, in the sense that
please do.
It's excess ego, which is a problem. You know, in my flying career, I've been faced with, let's just say, some very challenging situations.
Sure.
Whether it's having to take off in a large aircraft full of fuel, because I was a tanker aeroplane refueling a fighter jet, when I knew there was someone outside of the airport with a shoulder-launched missile looking to take us out, but we had to go. Of course, there's quite a bit of fear involved, and you had to have a degree of ego to say to yourself, yeah, I can handle this. I can deal with whatever comes along. So I think some ego is important. Ego is all about I and a bit of self-belief. It's when it gets in the way, to your point, and there's an excess of it, and you start to be driven by fear.
Well, and that's to me, that's the difference. So in my own language, the way I would describe that, and I think we're saying the exact same thing. You call it excess ego. I say successful people all have healthy egos. They all have belief in themselves.
Yeah.
What checking the ego at the door means is it means we don't make decisions to serve our ego. We make decisions to serve what we're for in your language. You know, or I would say to serve the needs of the team or the needs of others, or and again, in your language, the for, but it doesn't mean we don't have an ego. It means that the decision making is based upon what will serve the other needs versus, in many cases, when we think of what you call excess ego, I would call that making decisions to serve our ego. Making decisions to make me look good or to serve my needs instead of serving the mission, the purpose, the stand, or what we're for. That's a different story. I also noticed as I was reading your book, you make an interesting distinction, which I'd like you to go deeper on for us here. I'm a big believer, like you are, as you said, in language, and language distinctions are really important. And I like what you had some interesting distinctions, which mirror some of my own work around what you call authenticity and what you call integrity. So talk to us about that distinction and why that's an important distinction, because I think it relates also to serving others.
Yes. So I think I was on a run at the time when I was listening to a podcast. So it was something that the wonderful Seth Godin mentioned on this subject, which made me go, that's interesting. And it was around authenticity. And in the field of leadership and culture, there is a lot spoken about being authentic. You know, this is key.
The real you.
Yeah. And there was always something that just felt a little bit uncomfortable for me on that. And I didn't quite put my finger on it until listening to that podcast with Seth. And it prompted the the difference between authenticity and integrity. And a young child is authentic. When the child is hungry or tired, they'll scream, perhaps cry. That's authentic, totally unfiltered. This is how they're feeling in the moment. But when we get into maybe our early teens, I think we give up our right to be authentic. There's got to be a filter that comes in. And as far as leadership of ourselves and particularly others is concerned, that filter is what I call integrity. And let me give you an example again, an extreme example, but I think it's in the extremes of human experience that we really learn some fundamentals, to borrow one of your words, David. But I led I was the British force commander during the 2003 Gulf War. I led the air refueling the tanker deployment. We were based in the desert in Saudi. And during that time, I'd never been in that situation before. We flew large, unarmed, undefended aircraft, full of fuel. We were known as high-value target. Because take out an air refueling aircraft, you have a huge negative impact on the fighter jets who need the fuel. And I was fearful. I was fearful for the lives of my people. On the first night, I saw 40 men and women in these aircraft. Pretty sure I would not see them all back. And that affected me deeply then, and still affects me to this day. Largely because of the willingness with which they got into those airplanes. Yeah. And they didn't do it for any political cause. This was because they knew that those people around them wearing similar uniforms were relying on them to do their job, relying on them to refuel those fighter jets, because if those fighter jets weren't refueled, they wouldn't be able to give air cover to troops wearing American, British and Australian uniforms on the ground. If they didn't get that air cover, they'd die. It was as simple as that. So, that's what drove everybody. But I was fearful. But for me, as their leader, to demonstrate openly that fear or my doubts or my concerns, it would not have been in service of them. Mm-hmm. Because I can guarantee that every last one of them had doubts about what they were doing. They were fearful for their lives, their families. And they're looking towards me for some guidance in that very difficult moment. So that's where integrity trumped authenticity. To show my authentic feelings would not have helped them. It would not have been in service of them. It comes back to that being in service of your people theme. And so integrity is about recognizing what others are looking towards you for, and filtering your own feelings and what you may say or do in accordance with that. Yeah. So that's how I see authenticity and integrity.
There are so many of our fundamentals that we teach that a common theme in them is this idea of being in service to somebody else. Yeah. So one of our fundamentals we talk about a lot in every one of our clients, we call it speaking straight. And speaking straight is about having honest conversations with people in a way that actually helps make progress. So it's not just dumping on people in the name of truth or authenticity, but rather if I'm serving them, well, I can still be honest. It's not an excuse for not being honest, but I can be honest with you in a way that's helpful. And that means I have to be thinking about you and serving your needs instead of serving my needs. And there are so many things that fit in that category of if my purpose is to serve you, and I guess that goes back to your idea of being, for something. If I'm serving, if there's a purpose I'm serving, a people I'm serving, and I let that guide my decision making, then that works back to, okay, well, how am I going to handle this situation? If it's about me or it's about fear, in your language, then I'm making very different decisions.
Absolutely. And the whole context of this is back to where we started, David, which is Jumpseat Leadership is all about lifting people up, giving them the space and equipping them so when the time is right, they can take the lead. Yeah. And I can tell you that what I'm doing right now with my team, the majority of the people on my team are of a generation below mine. And what gives me the energy to move forwards and continue doing what I'm doing is the whole context of we're building something that they can carry on after I've taken a step back. And it completely shifts, excuse me, completely shifts the meaning of everything that I do, because it's not about me, it's about them.
Yeah, I could see the difference that has. So talk to me, we have a few minutes left, and I want to understand more. I get the concept, makes a lot of sense to me. I understand why this is so important. You go into and it seems to me that leader to leader, if I'm working with an individual leader, I can help them to see how important it is for them to play a significant role in Jumpseat Leadership. And I keep saying jump start for some reason. Like that, maybe that word is more familiar to me. It is. So I can see, if I'm working with an individual leader, how important it would be to help that leader to understand their responsibility to prepare their team and their team members to be able to lead themselves. My question for you is, so how do you build is it possible to, and if so, how do you build in an organization a culture in which that's how most people think? It's not just, oh, that guy or that woman may think that way, and great, we got an isolated case of that.
Yeah.
But how do we create a culture in an organization where that's the way we do things around here? Is that possible?
I believe it is, because I've been involved in it and seen it happen. So it's most easily captured around the three practices of Jumpseat Leadership. So the first is around commitment. And commitment is when we take our stands, those things that we deeply believe in, and put them into action. That's commitment. But then the practice of humble confidence. Humble confidence, as I mentioned earlier, is about being resolute on where you're going, but listening to those around you. And it's about learning to lead when you don't know the answer. And that is a mind shift change for all of us, because ever since we were at school, we've been rewarded for knowing the answer. You know, when we put our hand up, we get rewarded for knowing the answer. We go to college perhaps to learn more about knowing the answers. We get hired because we know the answers in a certain field. But then all of a sudden we get promoted and we're no longer doing that work. We're leading people. And if we've always got to be the one who knows the answer, we become the constriction in the pipe of progress. So using humble confidence and learning to lead when we don't know the answer, but instead we're drawing on the collective genius of our team to figure it out, that is a huge strength. And it calls on being very clear on your commitment, but also having the humility to lead, not by knowing the answer, but by learning how to ask the important questions. But then the final practice, which speaks directly to your point, David, is the practice of belonging. As human beings, we all seek a sense of belonging, whether that's family, our work team. It's who we are. We, grew up in tribes. If we go back thousands of years, it's who we are. And when we feel that we belong, we feel a sense of security. We feel able to step outside of our comfort zone. So many times in my different work experiences I've had in careers, I felt completely out of my depth. But I felt okay stepping into that unknown because I knew that people had my back. I knew that I belonged. And so nurturing a sense of belonging, what that does, it's so important if we're leading any team. Nurturing that sense of belonging, it opens people up to stepping outside of their own comfort zones. It opens up the possibility where people are choosing to do more than they're contracted to do because they want to, not because they have to. And so the question then is, how do we nurture that sense of belonging? And the words are simple, and that is, we show that we care. And often I hear senior people saying, well, I'm so busy, I don't have time, to spend with individuals. I've got a big team. Well, the great news is that the more senior you are, the less time you need to spend with people for them to feel that you care. And going back to my somewhat extreme example of the 2003 Gulf War, although I was exceptionally busy, I was working probably 18, 20 hours a day for weeks on end. I would find time to sit down perhaps with almost junior aircraft technicians. Would sit on the floor with my, leaning on the wall with a cup of coffee. I'd just chat to them for a few moments. How's things at home? Do you understand what's going on here? Anything that you need to do your job? It was a fleeting moment, but to them, they'll probably remember it for a long, long time because it's a deeply significant moment. It's like throwing a pebble in a pond, Those ripples go out. And the joy of choosing to lead people is seeking out those moments, those fleeting moments that can be deeply significant for those people within our team. So I like to say that, if you want to be significant, think small. It's those small moments, those one-to-one exchanges where people then get that you really care. No matter how busy you are, you really care. And those ripples go out far and wide. And through showing that you care, it nurtures this sense of belonging. And when you nurture that, people will choose to step up. They won't be afraid of not knowing the answer because you yourself are leading with humble confidence. They'll be focused on asking the important questions rather than always being the one who has to know the answer. And that is all brought together through a shared sense of commitment with stands that intertwine, and you know where you're heading, what your mission is. So yes, it is absolutely possible. And it's framed around commitment, humble confidence, and nurturing that sense of belonging.
Fantastic. Well, Peter, I really appreciate you sharing, your experience with this, and obviously everything you're teaching is coming from that very personal experience and your reflections about that. And certainly, I think of almost any organization, if we as leaders can learn to prepare our teams to take the next steps and get out of the way and help them to be successful, then we've served our teams, we've served our organizations, and we've served really what we stand for, to use your language there. So really powerful stuff.
Well, thank you. And I think everything you described, that's for me a definition of success. Yeah. When you go home at night, you smile. It's the joy that you feel.
Absolutely.
And when you see those that you've lifted up around you go on to lead, there's nothing better.
I'll bet. Well, thank you, Peter. It's been a pleasure to have you on Culture Architects podcast, and we'll look forward to publishing this so that our audience can benefit from your wisdom. And I would encourage people to pick up Leading from the Jump Seat. Peter Ducker, great book and well worth our audience checking out. Thanks so much.
David, absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode of Culture Architects with Peter Docker, former RAF pilot, leadership consultant, and executive coach, and the proponent and originator of Jumpseat Leadership. If you've been enjoying this show, make sure you take a second to subscribe, and that way you'll automatically get our new episodes whenever they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love it if you left us a review, and that way more folks like you can discover the show. See you next time at Culture Architects.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event, or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.